This is the fourth game in my series on the King's Gambit, hacking away with the King's Gambit, or caveman chess with the King's Gambit could be another expression. If you don't know what caveman chess is, it's basically crazy chess that only a caveman could probably get away with. In this video, we're now going to move on to, on move 3 for white, the move bishop to c4. Now, in the last 3 videos, we concentrated on the King's Gambit accepted, where black takes on f4, and here white playing knight to f3, and then black playing g5. And we looked at some very exciting games there. Now, I just want to give you a quick lowdown on this bishop to c4 move, and these 2 next videos, I'm giving you a very sort of introduction to the bishop c4 King's Gambit, and I'm hopefully going to give you pretty much everything you need to have in order to play this move, bishop to c4. Now, Bronstein commentated on this move that this is the way to play for a win. And in recent years, it seems that players such as Nigel Short, Morozevich, and other players who play the King's Gambit prefer the move bishop to c4. And it's probably because of the reason that after knight to f3, g5 is considered good for black, even though I've given some very interesting ideas for white in that variation. So bishop to c4 is a very interesting way to play. One of the main bonuses this move has over delaying the knight's development is that you do not run into the idea g5, g4, because your knight can stay at home on g1. I mean, on the downside, you can sometimes get hit by the queen to h4 check move when you have to move your king. And this might look a bit strange to a lot of people who first look at this position, and we'll come on to this more in the next game where I concentrate on queen to h4 check. But this is not such a big worry, because when black has moved his queen to h4, it will also become a target to attack. So white can quickly go knight to f3, attacking the queen, and white gains a lot of tempo against the black queen. So it's not as worrying as people might first look. Now, also in the next game of this series, the last game of the series, we're going to have a look very quickly at other options black can play instead of accepting the King's Gambit. Not too much to worry about there, but I'm going to very quickly just show you some of those options. Now, this game was a game I played, and I was playing Grandmaster Jonathan Parker in the English League. I've actually got a score, I believe, of 9.5 out of 11 with the King's Gambit, and that includes... this is over the last two years or so, and that includes games against really good grandmasters. So it really works extremely well for me. Now, in this game, Jonathan played knight to f6. Now, John Shaw, in his great book on the King's Gambit, has recommended knight to c6. Against this line, I recommend you play knight to f3, and now g5 is Shaw's recommendation. And here you have 2 ways to play. You can even go for d4, which is similar to what we looked at in the last game. The point being, after g4, we just take on f4. And after black takes on f3, we go queen takes f3, and we have a very dangerous attack here. One nice point in this position is that if black now grabs the pawn on d4, we do a similar tactic to what we saw in the last game. Can you remember that tactic? As soon as black takes his pawn on d4, very tempting. What can you play? Bishop takes f7 check. The point being, if king takes f7, queen to h5 check with a brilliant attacking position. For example, king g7, bishop e5 check. And now after knight to f6, white can simply take on d4. Pinning and winning. So that is a very nice line. So this is the kind of crazy caveman way of playing, and surely if you're playing the King's Gambit, this is the way that you want to play. So that's against John Shaw's like so-called refutation of this. I'm just going to go for, this is knight c6 after bishop c4. I'm recommending knight to f3 and d4. And if g4, just take on f4. If you want to play a little bit safer, you don't have to go d4 here. You could castle kingside. But again, if you want to play safe, you're really not playing the right opening, are you? You should go back to the Reti system or something equally as wet as that. I'm not saying it's bad. You know, people do like playing soft and wet chess sometimes, and including myself, but it's not in the spirit of the King's Gambit. And after castles, the point is, if white, against g4, you can simply move your knight back to e1, and this is about an equal position. You don't have to give up, sacrifice your knight. So that's against knight c6 what I play. I mean, most people here do play knight to f6. There's a major point here, and the major point is, well, it looks like e5 is a good move. But often when you have this knight on f6 and the white bishop on c4, e5 doesn't work because black can counterattack with d5. And I'm not going to look at this in any more depth because I know theoretically, in a coordinate computer, this counterattack d5 is a very good response to black. So we are not going to play e5 here. But just bear that in mind in the positions that you could encounter here. Here we shouldn't play e5. That's not the correct way to play. This doesn't work here. You should instead just defend your e-pawn by knight to c3. And this develops and defends the pawn. And now the main line, the old main line here is with c6. The game, Jonathan Parker took a different route here. He played bishop to b4. And we'll come back to this in a minute. This is another line. But c6, let's just have a quick look at this first. Now, with this move, black is trying to take a stake in the center with d5. Against this, I think white should play d4 first, allowing the move d5. Then you should take on d5. And the best square for your bishop, I mean, one of the old main lines here was to check the king, but the bishop wasn't very well placed on b5. I think the bishop is much better placed simply tucked back on b3. And the reason behind this is that the pawn on d5, black's pawn on d5, can no longer be defended by another black pawn because black doesn't have a pawn on the c or e file, so it can't be defended that way. So the bishop will always have pressure against d5. That just looks like a good place for the bishop. Given a chance here, white will win back his pawn on f4 and get castled quickly. Now, the way I always play this position with white, this old main line, and I really have a lot of faith in this position for white. I think white's doing very well. I always place my knight on g1 on e2 here. I find this useful because it blocks any checks on the e file. And also, my knight on e2 can come into the game via f4 and then to d5. So this is the way I play. And let's just say bishop to d6 here. I always go knight to e2. And now there's a couple of moves. f3 is very popular. And if f3, I simply capture on f3. And after my opponent castles kingside, I no longer want to castle kingside here because I think my king's a little bit exposed now. I've had to take the f-pawn. But instead, I've had lots of gains, which continue bishop to g5. A very nice pin, and then queen d2 is coming next, and I castle queenside, where my king is perfectly safe, all my pieces attacking, and I'm not even a pawn down here. So this seems like a very good option. If black doesn't play f3, let's say he castles, well, now I castle kingside, and if I'm given a chance, I'll take back the pawn on f4, and if a move like g5, I now always try to chip away at my opponent's pawn structure. Hopefully, by looking at the previous videos in this section, you've got used to some of the ideas that you should play in the King's Gambit against different structures. And one of the main ideas against g5 is to chip away moves like h4, try to destroy this pawn formation. And I think this leads to very promising play. I mean, if black ever takes on h4, all our pieces are flying. Knight takes f4, and black's king is very weak here with white's dangerous. All of white's pieces are very dangerously placed. So that's the old main line for you, and it's quite simple. I don't want to overcomplicate things really. I don't see the need to do that. But my opponent played bishop to b4 here, and again I'm going to stick with a general rule with this bishop to c4 line. A lot of time I like putting my knights on e2, and that's precisely what I played against Parker here. I simply wanted to put my knight on e2 so I could take on f4 with my knight here, and this looked like a very decent way to play in this position and a very good way to play in this position. So this was clearly the best way to play. There's a number of options here for black. I mean, if black doesn't do anything, I will just take the pawn back, and as we said in the first game of this series of videos in the King's Gambit, if white can ever win his pawn back on f4, then white should be better because of his pawn center. Now, my opponent, my very strong opponent, played knight takes e4 here. And this is probably the best way to play. And after this move, the point is if I take on e4, black plays d5 with a fork. But as we're playing the King's Gambit, the best way to answer such a move is by playing energetically and with developments. So simply castling here. So I simply castled kingside. Point being, if my opponent now castled, looks very natural. Other moves he has available. Well, if he takes on c3, I would have played d takes c3. I know I'm 2 pawns down, but look at my opponent only has one piece developed, his bishop. And one typical continuation would be something like bishop to c5 check, king to h1. And now let's say my opponent castles. I can go bishop takes f4. I'm only 1 pawn down now, but I have pressure against the f7 square with my bishop and rook. And I have very good development. I have queen d5 as a threat. And if something like d6, well, this looks natural time to develop. I mean, c6 would be a major error because now I could go bishop d6. And after something like bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, my opponent can never develop and I'm just going to be winning. I mean, for example, knight to a6, anyway, to try to get a piece out. I could even have the tactic rook takes f7, rook takes f7, rook to f1, having double power on this f7 square. So that would have been a very nasty idea. And if something like d6 here, well, then I can just start bringing my pieces around towards his king side. And again, when you've developed all your pieces in chess, you're trying to improve your attacking position. Look at what pieces are not doing much. And here the knight on e2 is not actually doing much in this position, and just try to bring it into the attack. With knight to g3, I'm moving it either into h5 or to e4 with attacking possibilities against my opponent's king. So that all looks very promising, that line. And that's why my opponent decided to castle kingside here. Now I was able to take on f4 with my knight, and this is a good square for my knight. Again, if I took on e4, I'd always allow d5, but now I am threatening to take on e4 because I have control over the d5 square. And c6 was the move my opponent played. Clearly the best move. He's trying to go d5 again. Other options available? Well, if knight takes c3, we get a similar line to before. I take with a d pawn. I go king to h1. And let's say c6. Well, there's an amazing move, actually, a novelty I found in this position. I mean, my opponent wants to go d5. But a beautiful move in typical coffee house Morphy style here would be knight to d5, which should be a lovely idea. Point being, if my opponent takes the knight on d5, I go queen takes d5, and I'm attacking his bishop, and I'm attacking f7. And even though I'm a piece down, all my pieces are breaking through. And we've seen so often in the King's Gambit, the pressure against f7 is the main idea. And if something like queen to e7 here, I just bring a piece into the attack, bishop g5. And I have a winning position here. You can check this on your computers at home if you want, but the computers say it's winning for white. Black is too undeveloped here. It just shows you the dangers in this position, some of the things that can go wrong. So instead of that, after knight takes f4, c6 was played, and we'll just have a little look at the game very quickly now, the rest of it. I decided to take on e4, d5 was played, and now I went knight to f6 check. Again, when you're playing the King's Gambit, you have to get in the habit of looking at the moves that go forwards. And we can see by this knight to f6 check, my brain was only thinking in one standard way. Forwards, forwards, forwards. My opponent took here. Now the point of my play is knight takes d5. And I'm attacking his queen with my rook and the knight. If queen to d4 check, well, I'd play knight to e3. My opponent checked with a bishop. I simply move knight to d3. And okay, my opponent has basically survived the opening quite well, but after some simple developing moves, we quickly find that my position still has great potential, mainly because I have the two bishops. I have this bishop pair, which is very good. And if my dark squared bishop ever gets to this diagonal, it's going to be a great attacking piece. And after bishop e6, for that reason, I kept the bishops on the board, bishop d3. Generally, when you have two bishops, and it is an open position, so the two bishops should be good, you should avoid exchanging a pair of bishops. And now my bishop did come to d2. I wasn't so worried about my opponent taking on b2 because it loses a lot of time for him. My opponent thought the same, so he developed. But now, again, I'm just playing as quickly, energetically as I can. And here, if my opponent took on this square, well, I have moves now, even like queen to h5 here, increasing the pressure. My rook coming to e1, still attacking with my dangerous bishop pair here. My opponent clearly didn't like that, so he played queen g5. And this comes back to attacking play, something I mentioned before. When you are attacking, I clearly am attacking here with my bishops. Look at all your pieces, trying to work out the best potential squares for your pieces and try to move those pieces to those squares. So which piece can I move around to a more aggressive square here? Can you find the correct move? Rook to f3, trying to bring the rook to g3. And my rook did get to g3. I pushed my opponent's queen back, and my queen came in the attack. And, well, the position got much worse for him. My last attacking piece came in, rook to f4, trying to bring it around to h4. Again, you've got to play in the spirit of the King's Gambit, even throughout the game. Attack, attack, attack. And after queen to f6, queen to f7, I simply took on c5 now, winning a pawn. And now I'm a pawn up with two bishops with the attack. And this should be good enough for a grandmaster win. And indeed, after my h-pawn stormed up the board, we had a lot more moves, but eventually I managed to break through. You can see this g6 square is very strong. No rush in these type of positions. You can take your time, but I open up the diagonal even more with this break e5. My opponent actually resigned around here, and he had enough. He actually, well, I'm also attacking the bishop on c4, and he knew he had no chance here. Critical moments of that game. Well, this is with the other option you have in the King's Gambit of playing bishop to c4. Now, against this main line of knight to f6, we simply go knight to c3, developing. If c6, we go d4, and we looked at this. Against bishop to b4, then I always recommend, remember in these bishop c4 lines, well, nearly always recommend you put your knight on e2. I don't recommend this if your opponent moves his queen out to h4 quickly. It wouldn't make any sense then because you want to attack that queen with knight to f3. But in most other lines, this knight to e2 move is good. Don't be in any rush to get your pawn back. I simply castled with speed here. Speed is much more important than material. There are lots of tricky lines my opponent could fall into. For example, here, if he takes on c3, we don't go with traditional values here, taken towards the center. It's much more important to open up our pieces because we're playing in Gambit fashion. Development is key. And then we just have to go quickly, quick developments. And for example, if this moves c6, I hope someone out there watching this video is able to get this lovely knight to d5 novelty in their games. But anyway, interesting opening there. In the next game in this series, we'll conclude our series of the King's Gambit, some tasty games in the King's Gambit, and we conclude our material with this bishop c4 stuff. So hope you enjoyed that game. One more game to go, and let me know how you get on with your King's Gambit. I really interested to know if anyone's able to get this position particularly on the board.